across the globe. So this idea of exporting freedom, of exporting democracy, obviously has a kind of relation to imperialism and neo-imperialism, both at the level of the spread of capitalism, but also at the level of war. This idea of we have to kind of bring our freedoms to other people. As Angela Robbie puts it, quote, feminism, again in inverted commas, is instrumentalized. It is brought forward and claimed by Western governments as a signal to the rest of the world that this is a key part of what freedom now means. Okay, so again you have this idea of a co-optation of the rhetoric, of the word itself, right? So liberation or freedom of feminism, but sort of the implicit coding being that this is a Western model, right? This is a neo-enlightenment model of freedom, that we are going to bring it to, barbaric, uncivilized people and explain to them that this is part and parcel of a Western image of what it means to be free. Similarly with the term empowerment, as McRobbie puts it, women are currently being disempowered through the very discourses of empowerment that they are being offered as substitutes for feminism. Okay, so there's a way in which there's a kind of faux feminism or a sort of feminism light, which takes up some of the rhetoric and the terms, but without the structural analysis in a way. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which work is marketed and branded as a form of emancipation, without a kind of serious, deep critique of what that work is and the forms of exploitation that are central to any form of selling one's labour power under capitalism, right? So, I mean, I've become particularly obsessed with the idea of job agencies, which are often branded in a particular way, especially to young women. If there's no longer much productive economy in a country, you have a kind of so-called feminization of labour, in which the work itself is no longer seen as men's work. It's no longer kind of manual work, but it's to do with knowledge economy, information manipulation, care work, emotional and affective labour. And job agencies obviously guarantee you absolutely no job security, absolutely no rights, absolutely no holiday pay. You can't work for more than 13 weeks at a single place, otherwise the agency will be forced to give you a week off. Right, structurally, job agencies, if you sign on, you don't know who your colleagues are, you don't know how many other people are on the books. They're very difficult to organise at the level of unionising workers. But the way in which they're branded culturally is often, in terms of this idea of empowerment, that particularly if you're a young, childless person, and particularly young women, you are sort of flexible. You're kind of free to sort of sell your labour in this kind of dynamic way, and it's almost supposed to be interesting that you work at all these different places, and people don't bother to learn your name because you'll be gone in like 2 weeks' time. So again, this kind of discourse of empowerment, it can't be seen outside of not only this exploitation of Western ideals to elsewhere, often at the point of a gun, but also in relation to the labour market. What purpose is served by using words like empowerment, emancipation, flexibility, given that those are the terms that are very useful for the post-war economy. Okay. So what happened to second wave feminism then? Well, initially, for Fraser, the strength of the second wave feminist movement was the way in which it combined what she calls 3 analytically distinct dimensions of gender injustice under a critique of, quote, androcentric state-organised capitalism. Okay, and these 3 dimensions for her that were linked inseparably by second wave feminism were economic dimension, cultural dimension, and the political dimension. Okay, and one of the most interesting parts of Fraser's argument, I think, is the way in which she argues that these 3 interlinked dimensions, so economic, cultural, and political dimensions, have been fragmented and broken apart. Okay, and we can see this too even in feminist work itself, which sometimes focuses, for example, just on culture. Right, so you have a feminist critique of culture, but without perhaps a kind of a similarly concomitant political and economic criticism. And it's very interesting and quite moving in a way that Angela McRobbie criticises herself for being part of this project. Right, so she says, look, I believe for a long time that we could subvert gender stereotypes through popular culture, right, by reading magazines in certain ways, by looking for a feminist, aspect in films and television, and she says, I was wrong, right? We can't do this, right? It may be interesting to do it, but it doesn't solve anything, right? It doesn't change anything fundamentally, just if you focus, primarily on kind of culture, right? Without thinking about the political context, without thinking about the demands of the labour market. Why are certain images of young women, or women in general, let's say labour-ready women, being pushed constantly, right? And she talks about, I don't know if you have them wherever you're from, but this kind of massive rise of certain kind of television shows which are all about getting people back into work and ready for work. So basically, what do you call it? Like giving people makeovers in order to basically make them presentable for work. Right, and some of them are even explicitly about the labour market. So you have a programme in Britain called The Fairy Job Mother, in which this really horrible, bossy woman goes to people in very poor parts of the country and shouts at them to, walk in a different way, to get their hair cut, to, I don't know, just basically prepare them for the labour market. And I think, one of the things I'm very interested in is the ideology of work itself. Okay, obviously you have a situation in which, capitalism needs workers, but it also needs a kind of ideological supplement, right, to make people think that they are first and foremost workers, right, above anything else. Okay, and obviously most people separation of the strands, about the sort of original second wave project, which is a kind of, as Fraser describes it, a much more of a kind of coherent whole, a critique, right? So, she says that the original second wave feminist project and the fragmentation of these strands, the economic, the physical and the cultural, that we can no longer see the feminist project in certain ways as the combined and inseparable desire for, quote, redistribution, recognition and representation, even if that's still its aim, right, simply because of the way it's been taken up and manipulated, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. So at the same time, however, she describes a process of selective incorporation and partial recuperation of some of these strands, the strands of second wave feminism, so that this utopian set of desires, original desires, unwittingly finds itself in a complicated way legitimising a new form of capitalism, as Robbie describes it as well. Okay, so a bit more on Fraser then. Fraser talks about four main sort of things, situations that second wave feminism was originally responding to. Okay, so I'll just briefly outline them. The first one is economism, which she describes as state-organised capitalism, which framed social questions in terms of distribution and class, and that tended to ignore other dimensions, sites and axes of injustice. Okay, so like a kind of older image of sort of social and economic justice, which focused on class. She says in a way that second wave feminism is responding to this, precisely saying, look, we can't just talk about class, we have to talk about women, we have to talk about racism, we have to talk about other forms of exploitation and injustice. The second thing that she says second wave feminism is responding to is androcentrism, namely the ideal, if not in practice, the image of the citizen is gendered as a male breadwinner, with any female wages earned seen as merely supplemental. Okay, so the image of the male breadwinner who, on his own salary, is enough to support a family, a wife and kids. Okay, and we know that, what she calls this the family wage ideal. Right, so even if very few families actually manage to achieve this ideal, nevertheless, this was the image of what the wage was. Right, that the man would earn the wage and it would actually be enough. Okay, obviously we've moved. If you think about couples and families, to a dual income system with very little, often very little discussion about that. And there are obviously emancipatory dimensions to this in terms of kind of economic independence of women and so on. But there's also an overall question about the lowering of everyone's wages, right? In order for this to happen, right? And this is absolutely not a criticism of feminism or the entry of women into the workforce, but it is exactly what capitalism did, right? If you create an entire new sort of, both culturally, politically, and in practice, a whole new pool of labour, let's say, right? You have it's very useful for capitalism to invent a concomitant idea that that wage labour is a form of independence and emancipation, even at the same time as you're lowering wages for everyone. Right? So it's a very double-edged thing in the sense that both women and men are now seen and understand themselves most often as first and foremost workers before they are mothers or fathers. Right? So this is particularly relevant to women. And obviously, on the one hand, this is of course, emancipatory, right? So women are no longer shackled to a natural role, yeah. But at the same time, if there's not a critique of work, work as exploitation, the forms of exploitation work, then it's not really full emancipation in any way that feminism would desire, right? It's not complete at all. Okay, so the third situation that she argues that second wave feminism was originally responding to, remember she's talking about the early 70s primarily, was statism, the way the state treated questions of justice as technical, bureaucratic and technocratic issues. And I think we could also call this paternalism, in which citizens are sort of being seen as the subject being told what's best for them. We often have this image in Britain of the BBC as this kind of paternalistic, in its original sort of desire, which was to inform and educate, right? So you have this idea of, the kind of elite, technocratic, usually men, sort of well-educated, posh people telling everyone else, what's best for them. We know what's best for you. This kind of technocratic model of governance. And the fourth thing that she thinks that second wave feminism is responding to is Westphalianism, which she describes as state-organised capitalism being seen first and foremost as a national formation, right? So a kind of national, if not nationalistic, image of politics that she says obscured cross-border injustices. Okay, so the politics is seen as sort of enclosed in each state. Okay, so second wave feminism, argues Fraser, was united with the New Left and anti-imperialist struggle in attacking certain dimensions of state-organised capitalism, but at the same time second wave feminism had an internal critique of the sexism of their colleagues in this struggle. So, and that people often talk about the unhappy marriage of feminism and Marxism or socialism, in the sense that clearly lots of patriarchal ideas remained in the left, and still remain in the left. If you go to communist conferences, they're often very male-dominated. So there's a kind of, an internal critique of the left that's also happening at the same time, solidarity with struggles against imperialism and so on, and capitalism. She argues that second wave feminism had this internal critique of the left whilst being on the left they did this by politicizing the personal to some extent. We know this phrase very well, and a kind of broader critique which sort of blew apart the kind of the economistic and narrow understanding of injustice. Okay, so by saying injustice is not simply about who has more money than someone else, there are other forms of injustice, and we can talk about those. We've been talking about those for decades. So, and also basically understanding injustice in an intersectionist way, in deep structural way, crossing gender injustice with injustices involving class, race, sexuality and nationality. So the way in which class becomes part of a series of interlinked forms of injustice. So that which was seen as private in a liberal state framework, so sex, domestic labour, domestic violence and reproduction, became public under second wave feminism, crossing economic, cultural and political lines. Second wave feminism further developed, argues Fraser, against this perceived bureaucratic managerialism, this kind of technocratic sort of top-down approach to governance, what she calls a horizontal counter-ethos of sisterly connection, and a kind of grassroots movement against those who declare themselves to be experts. But at the same time, certain elements have a kind of reformist dimension, attempt to transform state institutions so that they would promote and express gender justice. Finally, Fraser claims that secular